Good day and a very, very warm welcome to everyone joining us today at Al-Shabaka's Policy Lab. My name I'm going to be the facilitator for the next hour 15 minutes. We're joined by Tamara, Ben-Halim, and Hazem Jamjoum, who I'll introduce a bit further today. And thank you again, all of you, for joining us at this lab. For those who are unfamiliar with Shabaka, we are a Palestinian think tank, highly global in nature, with a network of about 200 analysts, largely Palestinian. We cover a wide range of issues and topics relating to the rights and welfare of Palestinians, issues from major political issues to economic questions and civil society, various levels of analysis. And you can find all of Shabaka's information on our website through Facebook and Twitter, and all our materials that we produce on there. For those of you who also have not seen our previous policy labs, the policy labs we're doing here are one of the new methods that Shabaka has been innovating these days to try to engage our different members to talk about particular issues. So one of our first policy labs was looking at the question of apartheid and the framework and how useful is the framework for the advancement of the Palestinian struggle. The most recent one, I believe, talked about Palestine and the post-Oslo questions. How do we rethink and reconceive of our politics after the Oslo Accords? And today we're going to be talking about the issue of Palestinian narrative and discourse. And this is actually the first policy lab for a policy circle within a Shabaka that's looking at the issue of the Palestinian narrative and discourse, dealing with a wide range of questions. Starting with what is the Palestinian narrative and what is the Palestinian discourse? How do we think about it and construct it? What is the content of it? How do we build a possibly unified narrative and discourse out of a very fragmented society and different experiences, etc.? And how do we then use narrative and discourse as a tool or as a strategy to help advance the rights of Palestinians worldwide? And these are some of the questions which our policy circle is engaging with, and we're happy to have our very first policy lab, our live stream online discussion of some of these questions. And today I'm happy to be joined by Tamara Ben-Halim, who is the director and co-founder of Makan, which is a Palestinian-led human rights educational organization. Tamara has worked in Arab civil society for the past 9 years, and she holds a first-class master's in human rights from the London School of Economics. And we are also joined by Hazem Jamjoum, who is a graduate student in modern religion and history at New York University. And his writing has focused on political economy approaches to Israeli colonialism and Palestinian elite formation and critiques of partition-based conflict management solutions. Thank you both very much for joining us, and I hope this discussion will be very fruitful and interesting to all. I'll offer 3 quick reminders to all our viewers. First of all, remember that you can participate in these policy labs. As you can see at the bottom of the screen that you're looking at, you can see a button that says Ask a Question. And you're invited to submit certain questions that you would like to pose to our speakers as a discussion is happening, or even right now if you wish. Also to our viewers on Facebook and YouTube, you're also welcome to post your comments there, the questions there. I'll also be facilitating those questions to ensure that our speakers can get to them. And please also remember that you can also vote on the questions that are posed. And this way we can also see which ones have the most interest among some of our speakers, and we can get to those first of all. A second reminder is that although this is our first policy lab, it's not actually our first product from the policy circle. A few weeks ago, Hazem Jamjoum, our guest here, wrote a commentary entitled Reclaiming the Political Dimension of the Palestinian Narrative, in which he will elaborate on a bit further in this current policy lab. And we highly encourage you to read that as an example of the kind of discussions that we're having in the circle. And the third reminder is to know in general that in addition to being able to find all our materials, all of the Shabaka's materials on our website, you can also go down to the bottom of the screen and you can sign up to Shabaka's newsletter. And of course, you can follow us on Facebook and Twitter. We highly encourage you to do so to stay constantly updated and up to speed of the many different issues that we're covering. Without further ado, I'm going to hand over the floor to our guests. I will start with Tamara, who is going to talk a little bit about some of the major questions in terms of dissecting what we mean by Palestinian narrative and why is it important for us to think about it as an issue of strategy. And she'll cover some of these big, large conceptual questions. And I'll then hand it over to Hazem, who will give a bit more of a specific example, talking especially about the political essence or the political nature of the Palestinian narrative and how it's necessary to reclaim this political essence in the way that we frame our discussions about our history and about our politics, etc. And so without further ado, I'll hand it over to Tamara. And again, to all our viewers, please, you're invited to ask your questions as the discussion is happening. Tamara, over to you.
Thank you, Amjad, and for having me. So as Amjad said, I'll just spend a few minutes thinking and talking about broad questions on narrative. What do we mean when we talk about narrative when it comes to specifically the Palestinian struggle, and what are some of the challenges facing us in building a unified narrative of sorts, and why do we even need to be doing that in the first place? So why should we be thinking about narrative in the first place? So for me, narrative comes down to how we choose to frame the Palestinian question, and precisely thinking about the language that we use. So precisely whether we choose to call it a question, whether we choose to call it a struggle or a conflict, because these inform the way in which we understand and therefore articulate them. So for example, for me, narrative is the difference between talking about Israel-Palestine as a top-down issue that needs to be solved or dealt with purely through negotiation and peace process, versus, for example, talking about it in terms of the actual day-to-day struggles and problems facing Palestinians on the ground. So if talking about the day-to-day struggles is one of the things that we want to do when thinking about building a Palestinian narrative, how are we encapsulating these day-to-day struggles? Is it through a framework of occupation, which only allows us to focus on the West Bank and Gaza? A framework of occupation most likely leads us towards thinking about a struggle based on statehood and in particular a Palestinian state. Or are we thinking about it through a framework of anti-colonialism, for example, which enables us to think about the struggle across all of historic Palestine, not just limited to the West Bank and Gaza, but also thinking about Israel 1948 and of course, right of return of refugees. So narrative for me is really the thread that kind of connects all of these different experiences of Palestinians, and that helps us to kind of make sense of the various kind of fragmented realities on the ground facing Palestinians, depending on where they are. So what is the purpose really of having a Palestinian narrative? Why do we need it? I think part of the reason why it's something that is on the minds of so many activists and academics and writers thinking about the Palestinian struggle is that the lack of a united Palestinian leadership really makes the question of narrative all the more important for us, because we don't have a legitimate entity to fall behind and that unites us all. So in a sense, it's up to us collectively to decide how we want to understand the Palestinian experience historically and in a contemporary sense, and second, how we want others to understand it. So others who aren't necessarily part of the struggle, but who may want to hear more about it and understand it, how we want to present it to them. And this is where I think the question of purpose comes in. So what is the actual purpose of a narrative? For me, it all depends on where we believe change is actually going to come from. If we believe that change is only going to come from inside Israel-Palestine, then perhaps a strong narrative that's kind of international and across borders wouldn't be so important. But because I suppose that many of us here, and it's an assumption, so it might be incorrect, but I suppose that many of us here believe that change has to, at least in part, come from outside, so from a shift in policy by influential countries like the US, the UK, France, Germany, then in order to create change, then we need kind of public opinion and policy towards Palestinians in those countries to shift. And so in that sense, a unified narrative is actually a tool of persuasion for us, a way for us to win over hearts and minds, whether it's of the average person on the ground, whether it's of policymakers or activists, fellow activists from other struggles. So as far as I understand it, the need for a narrative is important when we're thinking about how change actually comes from the outside, but not just from the inside. So seeing it really as a tool to win over hearts and minds. And my belief is that we have to have a strong and unified narrative that we collectively build in order to permeate into the consciousness of mass public opinion in those places. So just a couple of things to think about, because I don't want to spend much longer. I'd like to hand over to Hazem and to hear from everyone else as well. A couple of things to consider if we agree that it's of value to convince people of our cause, and that we need a strong and unified narrative in order to do so, then where does the tension between ideology and strategy come in? So, for example, how far are we willing actually to go in tailoring our message and getting people on side of the Palestinian cause, if this means using different languages and approaches? Are we willing to compromise on using words that have been actually crucial and critical parts of the Palestinian vocabulary historically and today, words that a lot of people, for example, in the Western world that people might not necessarily find very palatable. So words like resistance, words like struggle, words even like apartheid. How far are we willing to go to actually tailor our message in order to win people over? So that's a tension that I think would be interesting to explore. And then finally, if we agree again that a unified narrative is important to push out, then who is doing the articulating? So who is articulating the narrative and who has legitimacy to do so? The Palestinian movement has many allies and historically has done as well. So is it just Palestinians who get to speak out? Is it others that kind of have legitimacy also to speak on behalf of Palestinians? How do we decide who has a right to speak? So yeah, those are just some thoughts of mine, and I'll pass over now. Looking forward to the discussion.
I guess I'll just start. Thanks, Tamara. That was really rich. So what you said, Tamara, is kind of partly what I was sort of kind of taking aim at with my article, which is that for a good 20, 30 more years, a lot of energy that Palestinian organizers and political people expend has been spent in thinking about how to recruit the outside to support our cause. And this has been kind of the paradigm that we've worked in, whether with the PLO. I mean, we can think of Oslo essentially as the culmination on some level of a PLO strategy, at least since the defeat in Beirut and the siege and the Israeli occupation of Lebanon, to try to get Western powers to support the PLO by putting pressure on Israel and hopefully deliver a Palestinian state. And we've kind of seen where that's gone. The other side of this is that since Oslo, we've had this emerging kind of set of formations, loosely labeled Palestinian civil society, that have also followed a similar strategy of what kind of narrative, discourse, arguments do we need to put forward, and analysis, legal analysis has been really quite central to this. to get external support and solidarity. And so it's this idea, that Palestine is somehow, there's an inside and an outside in multiple levels, both within the Palestinian society, who remains in West Bank, 48 Palestine, Gaza, and outside, refugees, diaspora. But then also that there's some kind of vague notion of there's something Palestinian that has a right to speak about this, but is in extreme disarray with regards to the hollowing out of the PLO, the contenders to the PLO, and is a minefield, especially for us in the diaspora. It's something we kind of don't really know how to handle and touch. We may have our critiques of the PLO or Hamas or any other contender, but we don't really have a way of engaging directly with anything resembling some kind of representative body, which only exists in name and has only been used to sign away our rights as diaspora and refugee Palestinians, as well as the rights of Palestinians in the territory of Mandate Palestine, whether they're refugees or not refugees. And this is mirrored in the kinds of narratives, in the sense that we have 70s, 80s PLO narrative, which is very much from the high age of anti-colonial movements, where we have an external aggressor who's colonized our land. We're going to use armed struggle to expel them and liberate our country. There's a parallel line within the PLO's line, especially in its initial sort of constitutional type documents, which is we're going to use armed struggle to defeat Zionism and create a secular democratic state for all of its inhabitants, regardless of their religion, which is something that a lot of us have, that resonates with many of us, and I'm sure with many of the people who are kind of listening right now. After Oslo, we have that second kind of solidarity-based type of reasoning, which is similarly kind of trying to reach out to an external audience to mobilize solidarity using a moral case, right? Israel is committing all kinds of horrendous and cruel violations. You wouldn't accept this on you. You should stand with us, to coin a phrase. And it's based on the same kind of what I see as a certain kind of flattening, what I would think of as a sort of national flattening. This idea that, you know, we're accepting the idea that humanity is divided up into these nations. Each nation is entitled to a state. Notice that this is the same logic of the World Zionist Organization and the arguments they were making in the early 20th century for why they deserve a state of their own. And what that does, and why I find danger in this, is one, the flattening out means that all Palestinians become this amorphous blob. The internal power dynamics within Palestinian society are completely elided. So all of the kinds of marginalizations that happen within our society regarding gender, sexuality, ability, etc., these are glossed over because this is sort of like our internal dirty laundry that we don't take outside. And so it's off the table as far as a political conversation is concerned. The other thing is it kind of like limits us into just kind of thinking through a statist kind of logic. So we're not really thinking in terms of mobilization around these other axes of marginalization and within our community. And I think for me, most importantly, is I don't see Palestine as a primarily Palestinian issue that we call others to come and do solidarity. And that's how sort of something good is going to happen. I think that increasingly Israel has shown that Israel, in all of its kind of corporate and political and military and academic complexes, is actually very much completely imbricated, completely connected to some of the worst and cruelest kinds of discrimination, cruelty outside of Palestine as well. Whether it's through militarism, whether it's through the arms trade, whether it's through Israeli companies involved in gentrification, whether it's blood diamonds. Israel's the largest exporter of finished diamonds in the world. And we know many of these things, right? This is stuff that is sort of our bread and butter on some level. But what it means is that the fight against Zionism, which, by the way, now also, as we all know, has become a model, right? So the Israeli model of legitimizing institutionalized discrimination by saying, you know, yeah, it's totally fine to have a state that defines itself as being exclusively for one kind of people, is now a model for white nationalist supremacists in the United States and Europe, what are calling themselves identitarian movements. Israel physically does the training and provides the technology for all kinds of border regimes, biometrics, etc., this kind of thing. And so the fight against Zionism is as much an international struggle as the fight against institutionalized discrimination against, let's say, African Americans is part of our struggle. And this is not just a rhetorical line, right? This is not just to sound good. For me, this is actually quite real. And this is what I've been trying to argue, is that this is how we kind of, if we're going to reconceive of the Palestinian struggle in a way that has a hope of keeping the politics of that integral, we may not find all Palestinians agreeing, but we have not created the spaces to have these conversations so that a Palestinian movement with this kind of politics is being built, right? Instead, the people who would be having those conversations, and this is not a critique of solidarity, but what we have is all of our energy has gone into building solidarity with a cause, again, based on this idea of difference, right? That the Palestinian cause is a Palestinian cause and people come in as solidarity. And if we're lucky, Palestinians are organized enough in particular places where they give back that solidarity as if it's some kind of transaction of quid pro quo. And we're seeing this kind of solidarity logic mirrored in this quite horrific way, actually, in the sense that Gaza has been under siege and bombardment since 2007, for example. You have other Palestinians now sort of seeing their own actions as solidarity with Gaza. So not only are we no longer having that internationalist view that sees struggles against oppression as one struggle that we all need to build towards, we're seeing struggles within the Palestinian kind of body chopped up and sort of Palestinians outside in solidarity with Gaza, Gazans in solidarity with Palestinians in Lebanon, right? So the whole language has changed. And what I've tried to argue is that the kind of legalization of Palestinian language, political language, is partly to blame for this. And the way to sort of turn this back is to recenter the political dimension of our struggle and think together about how to sort of build that, maybe away from the sort of nation-state model and more using internationalism, anti-oppression as the kind of core building block that we build from. There, I'm sure there's much more to say.
Thanks very much, Hazem, and thank you both. That actually, I think it complements each other very, very well. And actually, and just to remind all our viewers again that you're welcome to submit more questions as the discussion continues, and you're welcome to also vote on some of the questions to bring them up to my attention. Because actually, I want to sort of continue off of Hazem's last point, because it also connects to what Tamara was speaking about earlier, and this is actually a question from which she mentioned that Tamara and also Hazem now, you mentioned the issue of words and language that are used in the discussion about Palestine and how we identify ourselves and the nature of the struggle, etc. And the issues of, for example, of self-censoring oneself and tailoring one's language in order to achieve this. But Nadia asks, in terms of determining the language and the discourse on these issues, does this not depend on the actual goal of the Palestinian struggle? Tamara raised these questions, and Hazem actually pointed to how the historical transformations of the goal of the Palestinian movement has changed very much over time. So how central is our objective, is the ultimate goal of the Palestinian movement, of Palestinian rights, to deciding the language and the words that we do use? And I think I'll pose this question first to Tamara, and then I would hand it over to Hazem to kind of elaborate more about the purpose of the goal and the role that plays in determining our words and our language.
Yeah, I mean, thanks, Nadia. I think that's a really important question, and I absolutely agree with Hazem that you can't have whether we're talking about the legalization kind of aspect of the struggle, you can't have any of that without having some form of political mobilization. I think that has unfortunately maybe been part of the paradox or the tension that the Palestine movement is dealing with and has been dealing with, which is that in the absence of a unified leadership, it's very difficult. We're having to do, or the Palestine movement is having to do several things at once. So kind of fighting and struggling for liberation of some sort, whether it's an anti-colonial type of liberation, or whether it's towards some kind of statehood, as Hazem said, that has kind of shifted historically over time. But in absence of a specific vision and a united leadership that's kind of helping the movement to move in a particular direction, I think it's really difficult to decide what kinds of words we use, precisely because I think many people within the movement, kind of internationally, are still figuring out how important it is to be working towards a particular political end game, or whether it's sufficient at the moment to be struggling for rights in absence of a unified leadership.
Yeah, I agree with Tamara. I mean, it is quite. I'll give two examples. One is the PLO paradigm of statehood, and just to show just how pernicious language can be. The PLO's line all along was we're fighting for a Palestinian state. Since 1974, there's been this kind of my computer's doing kind of updates all of a sudden. There's been this move towards what became called the solution in stages, or al-hal al-marhali, which the Israelis then adopted, by the way. And during the first Intifada, they changed the name of their own vision to solution in stages, or al-hal al-marhali. Which was to create a kind of, because the Israelis have never ever conceded that Palestinian autonomy would apply to the land. It would just apply to the population. This was sort of the sine qua non of the Camp David approach, which is still with us today. In the solidarity movement, for example, there is still a huge confusion where people, so I was at the Labor conference a few weeks ago, in the Labor convention in Liverpool, and for a very large group that was involved in this, solidarity with Palestinians meant creating a labor position supportive of the establishment of a Palestinian state. What we've seen through the whole Oslo process is that this is actually kind of a red herring. This notion of statehood is precisely the kind of strategy for getting Palestine off the agenda. Right? This notion that the Palestinian Authority can masquerade as a Palestinian state with increasing kind of authority over municipal issues like sewage and roads, basically making the occupation cheaper, removing these obligations off the occupying power, Israel. Because that fits within that international legal framework of sort of the paradigms that we assume international politics to work in, the state is the most important actor. What else could a Palestinian liberation look like other than some focus on statehood? There's an ignoring of the fact that this whole paradigm of Palestinian statehood is a way of getting rid of Palestinian refugee rights, Palestinian refugees' struggles to return, which is what I mean by rights here, of Palestinian citizens of Israel, and of the kind of extremely dire situation that this Palestinian state is projected to exist in a prison-type situation, right? Gaza is the world's largest prison and has been even before the 2007 siege. Since 1994, it's been a prison. I'll just stick to that. But language is extremely crucial. And I think what I've been trying to argue is about sort of pulling in the reins, at least within the realm of people who see this as a primary field of their politics, right? So organizers who see this as a primary part of what they work on, that they put effort into, that they organize around, that we need to start having conversations about what kind of language is the language of internationalism, is the language where class is an issue, gender is an issue, ability is an issue, sexuality is an issue, these other kind of axes of marginalization are issues, and to sort of reconstruct a narrative away from that nation-state paradigm, unless that's really what we're going for. But I'm not interested in another Arab dictatorship. But the people in my family and whatever, I don't want to kind of like go into the tugging at heartstrings, but people didn't give all of their lives to establish another Palestinian dictatorship, right? So so I think this issue of language is quite central, and this issue of where we want to go with it needs to determine that kind of language. And having these kinds of conversations where we kind of step back and rethink our assumptions about where it is we think we're going is where I think we are now, is we need to be having these conversations, not as just as conversations, but actually kind of trying to implement them on the local levels where we live, and finding other people, other internationalists and other people who see the need for a radical transformation of society, because the one that we have now is based fundamentally on exploitation. And to just perpetuate that makes this actually kind of not pointless, but it's not as rosy and utopic as we kind of make it out to seem if all we're going for is just to establish another state. It would be great not to have military boots and guns and F-16s bombing, but the way that it's going, that's not actually stopping, right?
So actually on this, Hazem, I think I would actually, I'll bring in an additional question that's brought by Sandra, which I would kind of, you know, to carry on this line of thought. Sandra asks, you know, if we could comment on the question of a civil rights approach to Palestinian liberation, and specifically a call for equality in all of historic Palestine. And you've mentioned this as being part of the PLO's original political agenda, the political program from the beginning. Sandra continues, you know, on this question, you know, how could we use this approach without giving legitimacy to Israel, you know, as a colonizing state? And does this narrative of civil rights and equality, you know, does this diminish Palestinian aspirations? And this comes again to how you've mentioned about the issues of human rights discourse, international law, even the language of nationalism. How do you see these issues, the questions of equality and civil rights, and how do we interpret these? And what role does that have in understanding our narrative?
This is a crucial, I think it's a very important question. Thanks, Sandra, for asking it. I think actually step one, I think equality needs to be front and center, because that is what we're talking about. Gender equality, equality regarding sexuality, equality regardless of race, religion, nationality, etc. The reason that equality at face value can seem like a step down is because the word equality itself, even the concept of the civil rights movement, even the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa have been whitewashed, right? We focus on the marches that are really feel good, right? We don't look at late Martin Luther King, at Malcolm X, people who are central to the actual civil rights movement, who are really centered the issue of struggle, of the fact that this is actually going against the interests, the material interests and the privileges of ruling and political classes that don't want this to happen, right? This was a fight, this was bloody, this was something that people really put their lives on the line, whether it's the civil rights movement in the United States or in South Africa. In South Africa, Nelson Mandela is celebrated as a hero of nonviolent resistance. Nelson Mandela was put in jail for decades for being the head of the militant wing of the ANC, right? And this is kind of left out of the story as well. Equality is not some fluffy, cloudy, airy-fairy thing. Equality is really the heart of the struggle, right? If I can be treated as an equal, regardless of my sexuality, my gender, my national, whatever, the color of my skin, the color of my eyes, then ultimately, that's ultimately what we're working for, right? It's also what Black Lives, I mean, what is Black Lives Matter? Black Lives Matter is saying Black lives are also matter, right? We want equality in this. And we can see how much of an uphill battle it is, even when it was an African-American president, but even more so, or just the same now. Because it's the same constellation of privileges that that these kind of ruling classes, not to sound too whatever, but that people with vested interests and privileges see the danger to those interests and privileges in allowing actual fundamental equality. And so I think through redefining equality, actually, we do a really great service to the language that we're using, right? So in terms of not just spouting off a language of equality because it sounds nice, but actually emphasizing the educational value of just how just what equality means, right? That it's not some easy, fluffy kind of thing, but it's a really uphill, difficult battle against some of the most powerful people and interests and conglomerations of interests in the world. I hope that answers the question on some level.
Yes,
yeah. So I'll just add to maybe just to respond to the second half of Sandra's question, which was kind of around, you know, using a civil rights approach, a call for equality in all of historic Palestine, and can we use this in a way that doesn't give legitimacy to the colonizers, and does it diminish Palestinian aspirations? I think that's a really good question, and I think again, it depends on what Palestinians' aspirations are, right? And as Hazem has pointed out very clearly, these have shifted over time, and you know, they're I guess, you know, in a world where you know, there's some kind of agreement as to what the actual aspirations of Palestinians are. If the aspirations were, broadly speaking, you know, living in equality across all of, if those were the aspirations, and therefore letting go of statehood and living together in one state, then, you know, I mean, I'm sure, you know, the generations of, you know, generation of personally my parents and my grandparents would say that it does diminish Palestinian aspirations and it does give legitimacy to Israel. But I think, you know, times have changed and the situation has changed, and I think that slowly over time, it seems that Palestinians at least seem to be more accepting of the idea that this could be a feasible option of living equally in one state. And so for me, and I can only speak as a Palestinian in the diaspora, who hasn't actually lived, you know, under occupation or blockade or discrimination or oppression of that kind. For me, I don't really see it as giving legitimacy, but rather, or diminishing aspirations, but rather having to adapt with the times and you know, being realistic and pragmatic about what the best possible outcomes for Palestinians are today.
Thank you both. And I'll again, to kind of continue this, this sort of line of questioning, and especially Tamara, I'm interested to also hear your thoughts on what's a bit of a difficult question, and Hazem, I'll also want to bring you in on this. Actually, before I continue, I want to remind everyone again, you're very welcome to continue submitting questions on our crowdcast or by commenting on Facebook or YouTube, and we'll see those. You can also vote again on the questions so they can come up to my attention. And we also encourage you again that you can also sign up to Al-Shabaka's newsletter to get some of the materials and the things that we are talking about today. You can also see those buttons at the bottom of the screen over there. Thank you, Tamara. And this again kind of continues on to the conversation about, in terms of understanding, you know, rethinking, you know, the centrality of statehood in the way that we're talking about the Palestinian struggle, the languages again that we're using. And we have a question here from Michael. And this is an issue that relates to the wider Palestinian strategy as a whole, and that I think also applies to the way that the Palestinian narrative is interlinked with the Israeli narrative in a way, and Israel's existence as a state that is colonizing Palestine to this day. Michael asks, 30 years ago, and arguably also today, anti-normalization was predicated as a central strategy to obtain a two-state solution. And essentially, anti-normalization was the idea that it's one based upon separation. And the idea of coming back to issues of statehood and nationhood, etc., is inherently one that talks about separation. And Michael asks, you know, with the demise of the two-state solution and the feasibility of it, does this necessitate a reassessment of the central strategy of separation and anti-normalization? And it comes back again to how we're talking about in the language, in our narrative, how do we relate to ourselves vis-a-vis the Israeli state, vis-a-vis Jewish Israelis? How do we rethink a narrative that takes into account, are we becoming more inclusive? of these new realities of a different people? Are we rethinking our identity entirely? Are we looking for our own kind of self-determination in the form of separation? These are very large questions and very complex questions, but I invite you to talk about this and to see how anti-normalization and the role of Israel in identifying ourselves and speaking about ourselves and what we're achieving, how you see that playing out.
Yeah, I think that's a great and very thought-provoking question. Again, if I look at the difference between, you know, as a Palestinian diaspora, if I look at the difference between, you know, the relationship of the generation of my parents, you know, to Palestine and to Israel, Palestine, broadly speaking, versus the relationship of peers and, you know, people within my generation, I think there is already a tangible difference, even in how we speak about Israel-Palestine, even in the sense that we use the word Israel. If I think of conversations I've had with people in my family, you know, who've genuinely become upset at my use of that word, because there's a sense that within that generation that if you use the word Israel, you're accepting the existence of the state. And of course, that's a reflection of, you know, that thinking of, you know, the need to kind of liberate the whole of historic Palestine, you know, historically. So again, I think it is a sign of times changing, that today, you know, we're more able to talk about Israel as a matter of fact, as, you know, it is something that exists, and we have to, or Palestinians inside have to think about, you know, what kind of relationship that they want to have to the Israeli state and to the Jewish Israeli population. And I guess maybe one last thing I might add is that, you know, I've experienced this also in terms of, you know, going in, flying into Israel. That's something that probably, you know, had I been from the earlier generation of my parents, is something that maybe wouldn't have been done. You know, this idea that you have to completely boycott, as Michael said, the Israeli state. I think things are different also because there's much more conversation now and kind of trying to encapsulate also Palestinians within Israel 48, which maybe before was a little bit different in terms of seeing them, you know, seeing Palestinians inside Israel purely as Arab Israelis, not with necessarily a Palestinian identity. But I think that has gone through quite a big shift as well.
Thank you. Hazem, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think Michael's question is based on the assumption and an argument I've seen before, a very strong argument, that if your strategy is one of boycott and anti-normalization, then you're entrenching the notion of difference, and anything that can come from that can only be based on separation. And there's a coherence to that logic, except insofar as it is actually really dependent on what it is that you're trying to stop normalizing. So the mid-century version of anti-normalization was a national one. So it was a normalization. So what people were fighting against was the normalization of a kind of Jewish national presence in Palestine. And so if you're going to boycott that, it actually becomes a little bit fuzzy. Are you boycotting Jewish or Zionist or national, or Jewish national, which is Zionist? What I would say is that definitely since Oslo, but also before, the real power of the anti-normalization campaign was an anti-normalization which was based on the normalization of the exclusivism of Zionism, right? So Zionism as an exclusivist, racist, institutionalized racist project, which means which means that what you want to stop, for example, a version of normalization is a Palestinian who serves in the as an Israeli high court judge. right? This person may be Palestinian. In a national logic, they're one of us, but in a political logic, they are the enemy, right? And so the normalization you're trying to stop is actually kind of blind to the issue of identity and nationality, and it's about the politics of the process of normalizing a regime that defines itself as exclusive to one kind of person and excludes everyone else, particularly the indigenous population, who we now identify as Palestinians, right? And have only, anyway. So I don't think that there's a contradiction there. I think that anti-normalization is one of our most potent tactics, right? The boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaign being a very clear example, right? Boycott, divestment, and sanctions, in the way that it's structured, is actually not so much about the national dimension and very much about those aspects of Zionist colonization, settler colonialism in Palestine that has been based on institutionalized discrimination and exclusion. And so normalization of the corporations and state agencies and projects and initiatives that perpetuate the normalization of that kind of institutionalized discrimination and exclusion, the furtherance of the settler colonial project, this is one of the most potent, as people who don't have mega armies and huge diplomatic support and the kind of resources that enable these high-level, state-level, mega corporation-level players to wreak havoc on our lives. Anti-normalization is one of the most potent weapons that we have, if understood correctly. Not as something that actually entrenches separation, but as something that builds momentum, builds education. So it's an educational tool as well, for people to understand what it is that we're fighting against and to participate in it and to recognize, and for me this is really kind of central, to recognize the interconnection between what we call the kind of like Zionist settler colonialism and the different destructive processes and oppressive processes that Zionist settler colonialism is involved in outside, in places like the UK, United States, Canada, India, Brazil, China, etc.
And also continuing on this issue and zooming out from the issue of our relationship to Israel and understanding our narrative, here we have a question from Zach, who comes to an issue which you also raised in your presentation at the beginning, looking at the international system. And here Zach asks, he says that we're seeing an increasing US or / Trump style rejection of the international system, which is basically manifesting as a sort of distrust or rejection of the UN and perhaps international institutions as a whole, which is getting a global fan base. On one side, you have a fan base from right-wing segments of society, and you also have from left-wing segments of society who both have this antagonism towards the way the international system and international institutions are operating today. Zach is asking, how can we also be incorporating this into our narrative and language, essentially that the UN is a central actor or has a key role in Palestinian dispossession, and perhaps even in the process kind of catalyze a rebuilding of global governance that decentralizes states and centralizes people. So he's asking again, like, how do we incorporate this issue of our understanding and our relationship with the United Nations and these global institutions into how we're thinking about our own narrative? Zach raises the point that we usually don't target the UN as a central actor, but if we do, are we spreading the narrative too thin? So how do we kind of, again, conceive of ourselves with these major institutions, which we usually view as positive, but maybe we should also be critical of in the way we talk about the Palestinian narrative? I'll direct this one to Hazem first.
So yeah, I'd actually like to hear what Tamara has to say about this. I don't think that we're the people who are going to protect the UN from US assault, right? Like, I don't think the Palestinians on any level, whether it's the Palestinian Authority or Palestinian organizers and activists or Palestinians living at home, who are going to be the protectors of the United Nations regardless, right? There's a lot of states who are heavily invested in the United Nations, and they're going to kind of do that. I would highlight, however, that if you sort of go through the Trumpist attacks on the United Nations, they're invariably invoking the fact that the United Nations criticizes Israel, right? So the issue of the U.S. special relationship with Israel and the U.S. as the #1 line of international diplomatic defense of the Zionist regime, this is what Trump and his kind of coterie and people who share his politics highlight when they want to highlight what's wrong with the UN. And that's generally kind of like front and center in terms of what they bring up. And so, again, sort of like taking a step back from the direct Trump type attack on the international legal regime, and seeing the fact that that Israel is being instrumentalized and weaponized against the United Nations, means that there's probably some allies out there who want to protect the UN, who have an interest in an argument that counters the one made by Trump and his ilk against the United Nations.
Yeah, what I'd like to add on that point is that I think the UN is actually a great example of using strategic tools that we have and being pragmatic versus of course the reality of how international law generally and the UN as the example that Zach gave have actually as institutions and entities have not been particularly kind to the Palestinians historically. So I think there's an important conversation here or thinking to be done about understanding the shortcomings of international law and the entities that make up the international legal order, like the United Nations. Understanding the shortcomings that Palestinians face when it comes to international law by virtue of the fact that Palestinians are a stateless people and therefore don't really fit into the kind of the member state world of international law. And at the same time, understanding that despite those shortcomings and despite the fact that, international law actually doesn't really mean much without political will, without kind of the strong nation states in the world actually choosing to make certain things happen. So putting sanctions in place or not, for example, in order to hold states that violate certain conventions or rights to account. I think whilst taking that into account, we also, for me, it's important also to understand that international law can be used as a tool to kind of advance Palestine advocacy and as a tool to kind of communicate the Palestinian struggle generally. So for me, it's really about taking what's useful from the world of international law and from the discourse surrounding international law to strengthen our case. So, to give specific examples, the International Court of Justice ruling on the Israeli wall. Those are the kinds of examples that are useful for us to use in our advocacy work. The UN Security Council resolution on settlements. So even if it's clear what the shortcomings are, those haven't resulted in any material change on the ground precisely because of a lack of political will. There are perhaps ways for us to incorporate them as advocacy and communication tools, and so taking what we need from that world.
And if I may actually interrogate this a bit more, Tamara, and this all connects to a question that Sam is also asking as we were discussing about kind of Palestine at the UN and international law. And Sam is talking about, as we're refining our narrative as well, how do we relate, as you guys were discussing, how do we relate to the actions and perhaps one could even say is progress that's being made in the way that Palestine is being codified on the global level. The fact that more than 130 countries are voting yes to Palestine in the UN, that there is this international legitimacy being granted on a global level to what the Palestinians are trying to achieve. And it comes back again to the conversations that we were having earlier, whereby, who has the legitimacy to decide certain things on Palestine? And here we sometimes see that international or global legitimacy sometimes does not fully meet with the desires, needs, or the full language and discourse of the particular Palestinian leadership or the Palestinian ground up, as you mentioned at the beginning of your talk. How do you think that one should be juggling this? Is it enough to think of things like votes at the UN and international as a tool? Is it supposed to be just simply following behind what the Palestinians decide, or to what extent should we be giving the international discussion, or the international legitimizing of Palestine its own course? Is it helpful? Is it not helpful? Or is it coming back to the issue that Hazem also raised in his article and is raising today about the agency of Palestinians and being able to determine their narrative, determine their political struggle? What are your takes on these kind of things?
Yeah, I mean, I'll weigh in briefly. Definitely interesting to hear what Hazem has to say about this. I think, I think obviously there has been some kind of progress made in terms of the codification of Palestine as a kind of pseudo member state at the UN, and this has resulted in certain material gains. Maybe the most one of the most relevant ones of them is the ability to have access to the International Criminal Court. So I think there are certain material gains that we shouldn't ignore, and I don't say that we should altogether abandon that approach. I believe that you need different approaches. I'm not someone who thinks that there's only one particular approach to a struggle for liberation. I think I do see to an extent international law as a tool, as a strategic tool, as I do many other things. Different kinds of tactics and techniques and strategies, all being used at the same time in a streamlined way towards a political outcome. So I think. So I think it's not to say that those efforts should be abandoned. I think those efforts hold their importance, but alone will they achieve what Palestinians are looking for in terms of liberation? However that liberation ends up looking, I don't think so.
Hazem, any comments? We'll just unmute right here.
There we go. I couldn't unmute it. Sorry about that. Okay, so I agree with Tamara. There's diversity of tactics, but there's a few points I want to raise to Sam's point, which is a very important point. One is, like, who are these states? Like, how is this progress, right? In the sense that, let's take an example. Amongst those states is something like Saudi Arabia, right? A state that has very clearly in the past few years, but for much longer than that, been a prime boon to the Zionist settler colonialism in Palestine. And especially since the Riyadh summit, which has enabled the Jerusalem embassy move, the defunding of UNRWA, the whole kind of constellation of policies that we've seen passed by these different regimes in the past few states. We've seen states, the United States' official State Department position is still one that kind of highlights international law and its importance. If you talk to people from our, these kind of nation states that are supposed to be our prime allies, like the Muslim world, where we go to Pakistan or Malaysia, invariably, any of us who's been in a conversation with people who are our prime supporters in these places, the education level is actually quite shallow, right? We support Palestine because it's a Muslim country. We support Palestine because it's an Arab country. We support Palestine because we're third world and that's part of European colonialism. And that's if you're lucky and somebody has a sense that colonialism is still alive and well and needs to be fought. We know that these regimes use Palestine to garner support within their states as kind of lip service to a very popular cause that then enables them to legitimize their own dictatorial regimes, not just in the Arab and Muslim world, but across the globe, right? And so we're actually unwittingly being used as pawns to kind of entrench these dictatorial and brutally oppressive regimes. And then we want to celebrate it because they vote for a statehood that's actually quite, like, really just on paper for now. Because ultimately, and this is the second major point I want to make, and this is not an original point, people have been making this for as long as international law has been around, which is that international law really kind of means very little outside and beyond sort of baseline for communication, which Tamara mentioned, and I actually believe in very strongly. I think it's a very useful way of saying, look, international law is a very low bar, but at least we can use it so that you can understand why exclusively Jewish settler colonies in the West Bank are something that are abhorrent and are illegal and should be and like it's part of a land grab. You're exporting a civilian population to occupied territories, etc., etc. International law is, and I'll give you another example. I mean, so, Tamara brought up the International Criminal Court. The International Court of Justice made a very widely celebrated ruling in 2004, which actually was one of the main things that led to the formation of PACB, and then the following year, the BDS called. The International Court of Justice, some people say it's not binding. The ICJ decision points to binding international law. So this is supposed to be the highest court in the world, pointing to laws that are ironclad, right? If anyone breaks them, you know, within a domestic setting, these would be the people who would be going to jail for grave war crimes, etc. And yet none of that's been implemented, right? The only times these things have been implemented is when Palestinians have gone out on a weekly basis, made such a headache for the Israeli military in the process of land grab that the Israelis make a decision to sort of move the wall back a few meters or kilometers, right? Ariel Sharon didn't decide to disengage from the Gaza Strip because international law, right? It was just a huge cost that the resistance in Gaza had imposed on the Israeli occupation, forcing it to withdraw all of this huge disproportionate number of soldiers required to protect a handful of settlers in the Gaza Strip, right? And so it's these fights on the ground that matter, regardless of international law. International law is great for communication. It can be very good for mobilization. It's proven its value as a means for us to go into third-party type institutions that care about international law, like corporations, universities, unions, churches, and communicate what it is about Zionist settler colonialism that they should be anti-normalizing with, right, or boycotting. And yet, none of this means anything unless we can build a movement with a certain kind of politics, and it's that politics that's going to determine things. The final point I want to make on this is that with the notion of national unity, we still have this romantic, and I mean it with a capital R, this 19th century romantic notion of our nation as one body. And yet, if we look at the history of the Palestinian struggle, it's been marked by differing types of politics. The one difference since Oslo is that these different kinds of politics are now only the kind of like bourgeois nationalists of the Palestinian Authority, and another kind of equally exclusive leadership in the form of Hamas in the Gaza Strip with its extensions elsewhere, right? And now I'm being very specific with what I mean by our voice as a kind of Palestinian left that takes the issues of social equality and the politics of society and relations between people, the issues of class, identity, gender, sexuality, ability, etc., as front and center in what our politics is about, i.e. the liberation of Palestinians, not the liberation of Palestine as the flag and the symbolism and the heraldry of what that means. For us, this is actually not that helpful, right? If the whole world is in solidarity with us on the basis of attaining votes at the UN for Palestinian statehood, that can only translate into any kind of freedom for people in Palestine, for Palestinians, that can only translate into that with a movement that's pushing for that, right? These votes, I don't want to say they're completely meaningless. I don't want to dismiss all of the work that goes into it. What I want to dismiss is the idea that we, the kind of like civilians outside who may or may not be political organizers, that we have to toe a certain national fake state line that the Palestinian Authority or Hamas puts out? Why is it that we can't develop our own set of politics and challenge the politics of the Palestinian Authority or Hamas? Why is it that we have to toe a line? Like, just because we're a colonized population, why do we have to have this sort of like one political line that all of us agree on? The one that used to be armed struggle until we produce another Arab dictatorship under our great man, Sheikh, who's going to be our king. And why does it now have to be, let's do everything so that we can get a chair at the United? You remember when Abu Mazen was parading around the world with a chair? I link a picture of it in the article, right? But this is how pathetic we've become, in the sense that Abu Mazen gets up in front of the Fatah conferences and twice in a row, the two past Fatah conferences, the one in Bethlehem and the one that just happened last year, and he's sort of talking about the achievements of the PLO and PA in these years towards statehood, and all he can come up with is like, we got people to wear seatbelts for a week, we built the largest knafe, we implemented, and then it turned out they didn't actually implement the kind of women's rights obligations under the CERD. Right, so this is the level of politics that we want to kind of put all of this energy into. Meanwhile, our own analysis of the situation is falling back because we haven't created the spaces to actually develop a new politics in light of these realities.
Thanks for those remarks. Thanks for those thoughts. I'm going to give the last final word to Tamara, maybe just to answer one last question to tie it all up. This is from Sarah, who sent us this question via Facebook. So for Tamara, Sarah asks that people sometimes erase the issue of justice from struggles of equality and human rights struggles in general, one can argue. And this is particularly an issue where people are talking about the right of return. And then I want to connect this back to some of your remarks at the very beginning, where in terms of thinking about narrative, in terms of balancing between ideology and principles with strategy. How do you see the conversation playing out when we're thinking about justice? How far should we be compromising, if at all, certain interpretations or understandings of justice in order to achieve equality or civil rights or a kind of a main political goal and objective for the Palestinian people? Tamara, I'll give you the last word on this before we have to wrap up.
Thank you, Amjad. It's a good question, and I don't think that's something that's negotiable. I mean, I don't think that doesn't really come down, I think, to strategy. Rather, it comes down more, strategy in terms of trying to communicate with others and convince others. I think the question of justice comes down to what Palestinians, who have obviously Palestinians as a collective who've been impacted in their various ways by the settler colonial movement. I think it really comes down to what Palestinians deem to be justice. I mean, if you look at other examples of mid or post-conflict reconciliation, historical examples of situations of reconciliation, conversations need to be had about what justice looks like for I mean, I don't want to say the victims, but for the oppressed population. Regardless of how flawed it was, in South Africa, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the decision to give amnesty, those are the kinds of decisions that are made, that need to be made by the Palestinians to decide what justice actually looks like. So I think achieving equality cannot be separated in any way from what justice actually looks like on the ground and what it means for Palestinians. Whether that's obviously right of return of refugees, compensation for those who don't wish to return, different forms of apology. That's not even a strong enough word, but those are the kinds of examples that historically enable a kind of a post-conflict situation to start to move towards some form of reconciliation, or at least a situation where people are able to live more or less side by side without serious violence and discrimination anymore. So I think that's not a negotiable thing. Justice is something that cannot be erased from any struggle for equality.
And I think on that very fine note, we are going to wrap up this policy lab. I want to thank both Tamara and Hazem for this really engaging and enlightening talk. This is really the first of our public conversations about the work that Al-Shabaka is doing on the issue of narrative and discourse. And thank you both. Bring about some of these important questions and see how to take it forward. Just so everyone knows, this policy lab is recorded. You can find it both on Facebook, and there will also be a YouTube link where you can see it. So if you would like to kind of look back at it, or if you would like to share it with anybody, please do. It will be available. This is the first of our Policy Circle's policy labs, and we hope to continue this conversation in the months and year ahead. I'd like to remind you all again that one of the first products of our Policy Circle is Hazem's article about reclaiming the political narrative, among the Palestinians. I highly encourage you all to read it, and we'll be producing more commentaries and policy briefs about this for us to be engaging and discussing about these issues and how to think strategically about using the narrative for the advancement of Palestinian rights. I encourage you again to sign up to Al-Shabaka's newsletter. You can hit the button at the bottom of the screen right there, or go onto our website, where you can also follow our Facebook and Twitter pages. And finally, we'd also like to emphasize that the Policy Labs and all the work that Al-Shabaka does is really supported by your support and your donations to the organization. And without your support, these Policy Labs and all our work in general cannot happen. And so we also encourage you and invite you to donate to Al-Shabaka to help support these conversations like this. As you can see, these are different Palestinian analysts, 2 in London, 1 in Haifa, and in the past we've had from multiple countries talking at the same time, and it's this kind of language and space that we would like to encourage here at Al-Shabaka. And so we invite you to give your support and to donate to Al-Shabaka. And on that note, I'd like to thank the speakers again, and thank you all the viewers for joining us. We hope you found it engaging. We hope to see you in future policy labs as well. Take care. Thank you both very much.
Thanks. Thanks for having us. Thanks for everyone who also participated with questions and tuned in.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care all.